Good morning and welcome to the Wetland Project Review webinar. We still have a few folks coming in, but I'm going to go ahead and get started while you still all have power this morning. Thanks for joining. I hope that this day finds you well and that you're able to have your electricity, make your tea and such this morning for our hour-long webinar. I will be your host today. My name is Laura LaPierre. I'm the Wetlands Program Manager. We developed this webinar based off of questions that are commonly asked, people who have filled out the survey that we had ahead of time, and also just common questions that we're getting in and what the district wetlands ecologists have found as points that need to be mentioned. So thank you all for coming so that we're able to relay this information. At the end of the webinar, we're going to be giving out a questionnaire so people can provide feedback from the webinar, and there'll also be a chance for you to request a certificate of attendance as well. For those of you who are certified wetland scientists, we thought that would be a good thing to include. So Teams basics, if you're new to Teams, here's the mute button. We ask that you guys mute so everyone can hear the speaking. There is the chat option where you can type in questions. Some other wetland staff are present today who will be able to help look at the chat while I'm presenting. You can also give comments verbally. We ask that comments be addressed at the end of the presentation unless there's some clarifying question you might have. We'll stop and address that then. But we definitely want to have a conversation at the end too. So I will turn off my camera to help with the bandwidth for this presentation. So I will be starting with some of the basics of the wetlands program, what we do, what our volumes are like, and why we do what we do. I'll be getting into our review process for projects in general, what to expect with requesting site visits, what our different permitting regimes are, what activities may or may not need a wetland permit, and some updates on tools that we have available for you. So there's a lot to cover, so I'll go ahead and get started with the basics of the program. So we're a small program who work from soup to nuts on wetland projects. We help people with the very basics of identifying locations of wetlands using desktop reviews and doing site visits. We work to assess the health of wetlands with our biomonitoring program. We support voluntary wetland restoration efforts with reviewing projects and working with other DEC staff with funding mechanisms and such. And we, of course, implement the Vermont wetland rules, which is separate from federal regulations. So the rules regulate activities within protected wetlands. Those wetlands that are protected in the state of Vermont are Class 1 and Class 2 wetlands. These are protected because they provide significant functions and values. They may only provide one significant function, maybe water quality protection, and that's still worthy of Class 2 designation. Most wetlands are class 2 and receive a 50-foot buffer zone that is also regulated. So any activities in those buffer zones may need a permit as well. Class 3 wetlands are your generally smaller areas. There may be the 3 parameters of soils, wetland loving plants, and hydrology, but the area just isn't rising to the level of significance and they aren't protected under the wetland rules. Class 1 wetlands are all listed by name in the Vermont wetland rules at the end. They have buffers varying from 100 feet to 400 feet in size, dependent on the functions that are being protected. The program issues permits when an activity cannot be placed elsewhere, and that functions and values are not adversely affected, or those adverse effects are mitigated with compensation in the end. So that's the very basics. Whenever you're talking with us about a permit, we say, does it have to go there? Can it be revised, etc. We have 7 people on staff who do permit reviews and regulatory field visits. We will be having a couple of temporary staff come on board to assist during this field season. But just so you understand the volume, we have over 200 permits annually and review over 1,000 projects. This shows where we have been looking at projects for a 5-year period, 2016 to 2020. It's our last real 5-year data collection that we have right now. And you can see where the concentration of projects and permits are throughout the state. And here's where impacts in general are throughout the states. Where concentration of projects and permits for this period are in the northwestern portion of the state, in northern Lake Champlain, and also north in Lake Memphremagog, that area 15 on the map. We also track the losses based off of permitting. And these numbers are only for projects that need a permit. There are also other activities occurring within wetlands that did not require a wetlands permit. And you see, this is over a 5-year period. So over that 5 years, there may have been 12 acres impacted in northern Lake Champlain, but that was over many, many separate projects where in all those wetlands are still protected with some impacts allowed. So more recently, here's our numbers for 2022. This is what we do with the reports when you submit us information about when you've completed your project. We know that wetland loss or enhancement did occur, and so we're able to track it. And so in 2022, there are 82 projects reported. And 7 counties had more wetland gain than loss. And overall throughout the state, there was more wetland enhancement and restoration than wetlands filled. Okay, so jumping on to our project review process. So we certainly love starting with pre-application review. It's very rare that we get a permit application with no pre-project review, and those are more difficult to process. So please contact us early for doing pre-application review. So we start with intaking the project, we receive an email, we receive a project intake form, and we determine whether this project is jurisdictional, whether there are wetlands on site, etc. You'll see in the chat that Crystal is adding various links for you to have access to that pertain to what I'm talking about. So please look at that. And for the recording, we'll put those also in the notes for the YouTube video. After a project intake, a lot of times we do a site visit. We don't always do a site visit. We want to do the site visits when we're reviewing delineations and reviewing proposed impacts. That needs to happen during the growing season for us to review a delineation. So that's a very seasonal step in our process. We can also do pre-application review outside of the site visit, and that would include submitting a site plan to us for review. Even if it's just a sketch at the time, we can give review, and then you can spend time with engineers for a final plan, etc. And then we get into the application review period where you submit your application. There are fees involved with submittal. So it's good to have the project well designed ahead of time. And in this application review, we need to review whether there's avoidance minimization of the resources, whether you're restoring, what's possible to restore, and what's remaining can be compensated for if there are impacts to functions and values. After the review, the draft permit goes onto a public comment period, 30 days for individual wetland permits. There's a period where we need to respond to comments. I'd say maybe 5% of permits actually have comments. And then when we issue the permit decision, there's a 30-day appeal period where there would only be an appeal by someone who has commented on the permit. Afterwards, we're still involved with the project. We have permit compliance follow-up that needs to be done. We needed to do lands recordings, and we may request a post-construction site visit as well, which will go over more later, but this is the general overview. Okay, so next is wetland classifications. This
Laura,
has recently changed. Yep.
On the previous slide, we have a question in the chat. Should the delineation review occur immediately after the delineation is completed or closer to the start of the permitting? On some projects, there can be several years between the delineation date and the final design permitting phase. You could answer that now or perhaps later in the presentation.
Yep, so we have a whole section of the presentation where I'll be going over this in more detail. But that is, yeah, dependent on your timeline. It is better to look at a delineation the year that it was delineated. The flags are fresh and the conditions should be more apparent within the same year. But there are other factors that I'll go over as well later. Thanks. So the wetland classifications have changed slightly from presumptive class 2 wetlands being listed in the Vermont wetland rules to categorical class 2 wetlands, where any wetland that meets one or more of the categories that were part of a statewide general determination earlier on, those are all class 2. So we're we've been able to, over the years, determine that wetlands that meet those categories always have significant functions and values. So this is a way of simplifying the process. There's also oddballs, as you know, wetlands are very dynamic and diverse. So there is still a process for you to petition a categorical class 2 wetland as class 3. There's also the opposite. If a wetland doesn't meet a category, it can still be considered significant, and they can go through a formal class 3 determination process to be officially designated as class 2. And as in all other versions of the Vermont wetland rules, map wetlands, wetlands on the Vermont significant wetlands inventory, and wetlands contiguous to those wet mapped areas are still class 2 wetlands. So that's nothing new. So I'll go over the different categories. The first category is wetlands that are greater than half an acre in size and are similar to those mapped on the Vermont Significant Wetlands Inventory maps. And here I just have an image to demonstrate that maybe you're evaluating the wetland within a power line corridor, but the wetland extends outside of the study area. We do need you to review whether that wetland extends, because the category isn't whether the wetland is half an acre on the parcel, it's if it's a half an acre in totality. So please be checking for that when you're doing your delineations. The other type is wetlands that contain dense, persistent, non-woody vegetation or a prevalence of woody vegetation and is adjacent to a stream, river, or open body of water and is over 2,500 square feet in size. So adjacency doesn't mean necessarily directly touching. A wetland that is still working with the stream is within the active floodplain and would be providing significant functions and values. So both of these types shown in the cross section here are considered 4.6B class 2. C is vernal pools, which we're getting very close to evaluation of vernal pools. So any wetland that is confirmed on the Vermont Vernal Pool Atlas is considered class 2. And certainly we would like you to evaluate other areas for whether they're vernal pools. And it is now the season. We do have some survey recommendations on our website, with the snapshot here being some of the timings, which, in a week or so, you might be able to look for wood frog egg masses. Next category is headwater wetlands, such as Sterling Pond up in Stowe. Any wetland that's above 2,500 feet in elevation and contributes to a stream is class 2. And those wetlands that are mapped as habitat for rare, threatened, endangered, or uncommon species, or are mapped as exemplary natural communities by the Vermont Natural Heritage Inventory. There may be some cases where you're not finding the species, and we talk with Natural Heritage, and it may be designated as class 3, but that's more of the details that we can work with you on when you have this situation. There is one remaining presumption in the wetland rule. So these wetlands, we'd like to check for significance, but are not categorically class 2. So these are wetlands that may be, that are under 2,500 square feet in size, but are adjacent to a water body. There are some instances where these wetlands are working in conjunction with one another and provide important functions, such as small stream size seeps that contribute to water flow. So in our statute, we're required to add wetlands to the Vermont Significant Wetlands Inventory. So any wetland that is found to meet a category may be added. We have a 30-day public comment period. And those wetlands can be viewed on the environmental notice bulletin. Okay, so now we'll get into the details of site visits. I want to give you a little bit of context here for the year for a district wetlands ecologist at DEC. So some of our work is seasonal, where other work is year-round. We can work on permit applications year-round, but during the growing season, the dark green areas here, staff are doing about 2 days in the field where they might not be responding to emails, doing permit review. And they do 1 to 5 site visits in a day. So that comes out to maybe 630 site visits for delineation review throughout the year. You saw earlier, I had a slide that showed that we do over 1,000 project reviews in a year. So you can understand that our delineation review is somewhat limited and we need to prioritize them during the field season. And also make sure we're doing a site visit when it's absolutely necessary. Staff during the field season tend to be booked out a month ahead, so please plan accordingly so that you're able to get your site reviewed during the proper time. So not all activities need a site visit. Those that are required for a site visit are delineation reviews for individual wetland permits. We recommend that we talk with you about difficult wetland situations. We can come out in the field and help with review of the boundary. If you have a project that's really close to a wetland boundary, and also if your project will require sign off for other permits, such as Act 250 land use permits. There are some instances where we may need to decline a site visit request. If we're able to do a desktop review and find that the information that you provided is adequate as an allowed use, or if we're not really sure what the project is, we might be asking more information before setting up a site visit. Best practice is to requesting a site visit within the year the delineation was performed and when the plants can be identified. We also like to be able to sync that with project planning. So if you have your delineation that year and you're going to have your site plans drafted that year, maybe waiting a month or so to get both of them at the same time for the site visit would be really ideal. And, also we want to keep within your client's timeline as well. So we can certainly consider that. So the site visit process starts with submitting an inquiry form. The QR code will take you to our inquiry form. Maps, we'd really like to see those 5 days before the site visit to help us prepare to know what we're going to be seeing. We'd like you to bring hard copies to the site visits, including delineation forms for the boundaries in question. We'd like to see on the maps flag numbers, topography, property boundaries. And this is asking for the wetland locations, what was delineated. It's okay if it's just a sketch. Having as much information as possible is good. Prepping the site, we'd like to have wetland flagging present. If there isn't, it's really difficult to tell where the boundary is. And we also prefer no recent mowing, so the plants can be identified. It's good to have as few people as possible at the site visits for efficiency and such. But it's really helpful to have the delineator on the site to discuss boundary questions with the district ecologist. We'd like to include the project manager if there's project layout discussions, and certainly if the project has a compliance issue, having the landowner on site to understand what compliance actions might be is helpful. So after the site visit, we have correspondence that we can have. So staff try to give you as much information as possible on the site visit, because once they're done with your site visit, they're off to other sites throughout that day. So it's really helpful for us that if you need or desire written correspondence about the site visit, that you provide what you need in an email and ask staff for confirmation. So you might want confirmation of a delineation approval, confirmation of next steps, or have a site plan for us to review. So that email could have things like the site visit date, location, what the wetland classification was said to be, a sketch map, what you believe are the next steps, and include the request, please confirm your email. And that makes it a lot simpler for the district ecologist to write back to you and say, yep, I agree, or something like, actually it's slightly different, and give you that additional information. Okay, so jumping into allowed uses. So allowed uses are activities that do not require a wetlands permit, and there is quite a list here. Don't take this list at face values. There's many details to the list of what parts of these activities can or cannot be done without a permit. So some activities require no filling or draining of wetlands, such as snowmobiling or wild food harvest. And then others require following best management practices, for like boardwalks and utility poles are two that have best management practices. And then other allowed uses require the program to approve the project, such as wetland restoration projects or invasive species removal other than hand pulling. Those both need that sort of thing. So I'll get into details of a couple of common allowed uses. So for 6.2, this is maintenance, reconstruction, or routine repair of structures and facilities, as well as non-substantial expansion or modification. So one example might be the house burns down, you can replace that, do reconstruction. Within the footprint, you can have a taller house, you can have a shorter house. If you make it a wider house, that additional area of footprint would need a permit if it's more than 250 square feet. The structure may be considered abandoned if its original features aren't evident and it cannot be easily distinguished from the adjacent area. There's also temporary work zones that are allowed when you're doing maintenance and reconstruction. So for facilities, that means a temporary work zone extending up to 10 feet beyond the edge of the existing ground structure or 20 feet on center over an underground pipeline. So you can do work in that area, cut the vegetation that you need to get in there, but it should be at the original grade and allowed to restore, allowed to revegetate. The temporary work zone does not expand if you're expanding the footprint. So if you have a new addition of 250 square feet, you need to do the work within the 10-foot zone of the existing structure. We have some specific guidance for roadways and wetlands. The existing footprint of the road is the travel surface, road shoulder, and ditches. The right-of-way may be broader than the actual structure. The allowed use only qualifies within the existing footprint, not the entire road right-of-way. And there are many roads in Vermont that have been abandoned. So if you can't drive a car down the road, then it's likely considered abandoned. Also, if there's no travel surface, if it's just a couple of ruts in the grass, that's not a road structure, it's a travel way. And if you're looking to upgrade that area into a road, it would need a permit. So, for example, if you are looking to do a utility within the road shoulder, and the road shoulder is going to continue to appear the same as it was in the past, that's a non-substantial modification, no permit is needed. If you're looking to do that within the right of way, but outside of the structure of the road, then you would need a permit. We also have guidance documents on boardwalks and viewing platforms and trails. This has become increasingly popular. So we have a BMP and a guidance document for that, which is being put in the chat in the notes below for the YouTube video. So these boardwalks and platforms must be under 5 feet wide if they're within wetland or buffer zone. And they must be mounted on posts or floats. If you're putting in concrete footings or doing earth fill, those are things that might need a wetlands permit. Non-native nuisance plant control is another activity that we commonly see and we need to approve as an allowed use. If you're working for the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife or NRCS, they both have general plans for nuisance plant control work that if you follow that guidance, you'll be able to qualify as an allowed use. It's pre-approved. If you'd like to submit a plan for mechanical control or herbicide use, you'll need to include these 10 things: locations, what the wetland community is, your target plant, methods of treatment and control, and your follow-up work. Okay, so moving on to wetland permitting. So here are the different categories of wetland permitting. I included allowed uses in there because some of those allowed uses, like I mentioned before, require approval. So those are just an email to your district wetlands ecologist with information of your plan and such. We have a non-reporting general permit for agricultural use only. Registrations, which are simply filling out a form, sending it to us. Once it's sent, you can start the work. We have a general permit where you send us an application and we review whether you qualify under the general terms of that permit. And there is a 14-day public notice period before you receive approval for that work. Those are for smaller impacts, of course. And then for larger impacts, we're looking at an individual permit application where there's a 30-day public notice period for that. There are two general permits. One is for any type of project with a 3 to 5,000 square foot threshold, depending on if you have a linear project or not. And then the other general permit is the water quality general permit, which includes non-reporting aspects, registrations, and general permit types. So we ask that people submit applications and fees on A&R online because that's the swiftest way to get intake of your application. Since the pandemic, a lot of program staff are working from distant offices from where mail is sent. So that's just the new form. The water quality permits, to give a bit more details, those are specifically for non-reporting of agricultural trails, walkways, constructed wetlands, and heavy use areas, as well as stream crossings, all for agricultural projects. If you read the general permit and you can do a stream crossing that fits under those parameters, you can go ahead and do the project for agricultural use. There's also registration and general permit notice of authorization for stormwater retrofit projects, either new structures of a retrofit site or changes to an existing stormwater feature for retrofit sites. Either one can qualify. Stream crossings, repairs and replacements that are for flood repair or providing aquatic organism passage may qualify under this permit. And then also filling wastewater systems are another qualifying project for the water quality general permit. Okay, so once the permit is issued and you're looking to start work, there's a couple of standard reporting forms that we are looking for. Right off, we'd like you to record the permit with the town records. So you take the notice document and you bring it to the town, they stamp it, you send us the stamped document through the A&R online portal, and that gets recorded. That's really helpful for if the land ever changes hands, the new person will know that there's a wetland and a permit on file and will contact us. And that does a world of difference to prevent inadvertent wetland violations. So thank you for doing that town recording when you receive a permit. We also, by standard, want to know when you start your work. So we can know that the activity is occurring. And of course, we want a work completion certificate. as well, so that we know that the work has occurred and we can request a follow-up site visit if necessary. All of this can be submitted through A&R Online. It doesn't have to be the permittee themselves. They can designate somebody else to do that work. So that is certainly an option. Now, we generally don't accept submittal of a quick email that says, hey, I'm starting my project next week. We ask that these all get submitted through A&R Online because we have so many projects that are coming through. It really helps us stay organized and streamlines our ability to respond back to you. So thank you for doing that. Okay, so now we're on to the last section here on other tools and practices. So I went very quickly through a lot of material. Don't worry, there's more details on the website. We have so much on our website that it can be difficult to navigate, I know. So we'll put in the chat these two locations. We have allowed use, best manage guidance, as well as best management practices. That includes agricultural work, silviculture, wildlife management, utilities, and such. That's a whole page on our website. And then there's also our growing list of procedures on the Vermont Wetland Rules, and that's on the rule webpage. And here's the list of what we have so far. The most recent one was the emergency actions document, which was extremely helpful when we were dealing with the floods this July. So please check these out. Staff will, if you talk to staff directly, they might refer you to these documents. And we are working on creating more guidance materials so that it's very transparent on how we're acting under the wetland rules. Here's a tool that can help you with your first effort in evaluating a site. Certainly consultants are really familiar with using the A&R Atlas and understanding all the multitude of layers that you want to look at to determine whether you have a wetland. Not all wetlands are on the Vermont Significant Wetlands Inventory. Not all of them are on the advisory layer. Some are only, there's an indication that there's hydric soils and such. This screening tool really breaks it all down for you on whether your project likely has a wetland or not and which district ecologist to be contacting. The screening tool provides you with the map with all the details, but also there's drop downs for all of the different layers that provides information on what that layer means. I saw in the chat, someone was specifically asking about advisory maps versus the VSWI. This would give you that information, but I'll also just say that the advisory layer is an informal tool where we've been updating wetland areas as we see them, just for general use and knowledge. Those wetlands may or may not be regulated by the state. They're shown here in the atlas in this light green. The Vermont Significant Wetlands Inventory are wetlands that are considered class 1 or class 2 and protected under the wetland rules. So those are definitively protected. And they're here in this teal green area. And you'll see some of these polygons may be very circular, and then some might be more detailed, whereas this one was delineated and added to the maps later. Okay, so another tool that's coming out that we're extremely excited about is we are getting statewide national wetlands inventory updates. We have both federal and state funds to update our terribly old and terribly undermapped wetlands in the state. And here's our timeline for that, where basically all of the wetlands will be updated by 2026. That's coming up fast. We have a whole YouTube presentation on the updates, so I won't get into too many of the details of that here. Just know that this process is ongoing, and that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Wetlands Inventory will be updated incrementally starting this May. The Lamoille River Basin, that area in light green, is going to be added. And then next up will be the Otter Creek and Winooski areas. Those will be completed this July, which is very exciting. What that does is that's the federal standard for wetland mapping. As you know, our Vermont significant wetlands inventory has jurisdictional status for wetland protection. So we're going to be using the National Wetlands Inventory update that's reviewed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and filter that. So what we'll be doing is removing those features on the national map that are not protected wetlands and including just those wetlands that meet categorical class 2 and adding those onto the Vermont Significant Wetlands Inventory. That will be done with a statewide notice on the Environmental Notice Bulletin. So if you'd like to stay up to date on that, please send us, go to the Environmental Notice Bulletin and sign up for those updates. And you'll be able to look at an interactive map of changes. Okay, so I want to save some time for questions, but I wanted to end on, thank you for all that you do for wetlands. Your role may be to fill out applications, redesign projects, or actually getting out into the field, getting your boots wet to collect wetland information. All this work really helps us collectively reach our no net loss goal for the state of Vermont so that we can continue to have important wetland functions and values. So thanks, everybody. And with that, I'll start taking the questions. Looks like we had a good list coming in, Zapata.
Yes, we did. And I can go through the questions that came into the chat during the presentation. You can also raise your hand if you have a question you'd like to ask verbally, in which case we'll let you know to take yourself off mute. The first question you did answer, and that was from Stephen about the delineation review and when it should occur immediately after the delineation is completed or closer to the start of permitting. Recognizing that some projects, there could be several years between that delineation date and the final design. And you indicated that doing the delineation and its review during the same year, same growing season, is preferable and recommended. The second question.
And Zapata, I'll just add to that Wetland delineations, the boundaries may change over time. I'm not sure if I emphasized this enough in my presentation, but delineation approvals are good for a 5-year period. So if you have a delineation that's 5 years old that was reviewed in the past, we may need to come in and review it again, and the boundary might have changed. So thanks.
Great. And Alice asks, what is the difference between a VSWI Class 2 wetland and a quote advisory Class 2 wetland that is designated during the site review by a certified wetlands person? How would an advisory layer wetland become a VSWI Class 2 wetland?
All right, great. So advisory wetlands have not been determined whether they're protected class 2 or not. So when someone comes in and delineates that area that's mapped as advisory wetland, you'd then look to see if that wetland meets one of the categories of class 2. So it may extend off the site and connect to a VSWI mapped area. That would make it class 2. If it's over half an acre in size, connected to a stream, a vernal pool, etc., from the presentation. So it doesn't have to be mapped on the VSWI to be a class 2 wetland, but we are working to add those wetlands onto the VSWI map. It may be added through this broader effort that we're doing through the National Wetlands Inventory, or it may be added because you end up submitting a permit application for impacts to that wetland. That's a time when we're able to individually add those wetlands to the Vermont Significant Wetlands Inventory.
Great, thank you. And Levi is asking, going back to these slides regarding significant natural communities and the presence of rare, threatened, or endangered species. Levi is asking, I'm double checking, presence of an uncommon, an S3 species within a wetland triggers it to be class 2? Question.
Yes. So it's categorically class 2.
Good question.
And if that is questioned by the applicant, whether it's really significant, the applicant can petition for class 3 for further review.
Great. Coming back to delineations, you mentioned that delineations extending outside the property lines. So do designers have to assume they are prohibited from trespassing on other properties, especially since the result of the trespass is to encumber their land? Could you speak to how this situation is handled, as it must be common?
Yeah, so this can be reviewed through desktop review, looking at hydric soils, looking at aerial interpretation and such. We've also commonly seen that the wetland isn't delineated on the other site, but the consultants may have put on the map like the area of estimated extension of the wetland. This is not asking for you to trespass on the property at all. Please don't do that. There are various other ways that it can be looked at. It can be evaluated, and we can certainly help with that if that's an issue, if you're not sure if the wetland extends off the site. And I'm not a lawyer, but I don't believe this is considered encumbering their land. They can always get a wetlands permit if they have an activity that might necessitate impacts.
We also have a series of questions going back to some allowed uses. The first came from Michelle. asking if dam removal is an allowed use. I put in the chat that the short answer is yes, but with an approved plan.
Yeah.
She would like to know when a permit might be required for those types of activities that are approved with a plan, or when a permit might be needed.
Yep. So that's really best addressed on a case-by-case basis. But if you have any hard infrastructure associated with the project, I can think of a case of like a dam repair where the dam was being repaired, but they also wanted to expand a swimming area adjacent to the dam. That portion of the project was not considered part of the allowed use and needed a permit. Like if you're putting in, riprap, hardening of ditches and such, where it hadn't been before, that's something that might need a permit. Doing work within the actual footprint of the reservoir, digging out the sediments, or, traveling within the area that was filled with water in the past, for that construction period. Those are things that could be approved as an allowed use, but putting in new roads or other infrastructure would need a permit.
Great. The other allowed use question that's come up is for non-native nuisance plant control. It's an allowed use, but there's little policy consistency around the use of herbicide specifically. If a wetland ecologist is reticent to approve the use of an herbicide, how would pursuing the Fish and Wildlife or NRCS route be viewed by your program, essentially bypassing wetlands review? So like a memorandum of operation, for example.
Yeah, so those going through Fish and Wildlife and NRCS is by using a plan that's been approved by the agency. So it's not bypassing our program. It's if you're doing a Fish and Wildlife project or an NRCS project that follows their approved plan, then it's an allowed use approval.
And I think an aspect to that question also is that our program is required to look at the best alternatives options for a given site, looking at potential inadvertent take or impact that herbicide might entail. So we have to look at all of the options that are available to know which is the best one for a given site. Going back to the permitting process, do permit transfer forms need to be filled out for every property transfer or only before work has been completed?
Great question. Yeah. So permits are basically construction permits. So if the activity's already occurred, you've filled out the certification of completion and sent it to us, and then you sell the land, that doesn't need a permit transfer form. The work has already been done and any maintenance is an allowed use for that structure that was placed there. We do need permit transfer forms if the construction work hasn't happened yet. So that's when we need that piece of information in our records.
And I know we're up against time. There's just a couple more questions. Who should we contact for violation of wetland permit, specifically related to improper erosion and sediment control resulting in large amounts of sediment flowing into the wetland? I initiated a response by putting in 2 links in the chat. Because this could be both a wetlands violation and a stormwater issue, the best is to report via the online environmental violation report porthole, which can also allow you to do that anonymously. And then conversely, you can send an email to the district wetland ecologist, and our contacts for the state are there. So you can click on the map to find the district ecologist, and then we can investigate. And then I thought I saw yes. Good morning. I have 2 wetlands that were created by excavation. Very square shapes, both of them. What can I expect when one is nearly all upland species and the soil isn't hydric, but does have redox? The other seems well established.
Okay, so look at section 3 of the Vermont wetland rules, or, talk with us directly. If a pond has been created in upland area, so there was never wetland there before, and somebody created a intentional pond, that would be an exempt feature. If this is, there's also a lot of parts of the state where work has been done over many, many years. And if an area isn't distinctly a pond created in upland, but there's been some movement of land material and such, it may be considered a wetland area. So I'm not sure from your question specifically if we're talking about like a pond or just a squarish kind of wetland area. So we'd want to follow up on that piece. But in the end, it's also asking, does this wetland provide significant functions and values as well for protections?
Great. And then some processing questions from Sam. Will there be an update to the wetland project search tool, which allows us to see submitted plans and permit information similar to what the wastewater permit search allows us to do?
I would love that. Right now, our search tool just shows you what has a permit and what doesn't, and can give you project numbers, so you can email our program to get the plans and the permit information. Currently, there's no specific project underway to get it populated with that information, but I think that would be a great idea, and it should be something that we make available because all of our materials are have public access.
Great. Could you also summarize how cumulative impacts are calculated for larger or recurring projects on a single parcel?
Okay, so for cumulative impacts, we're looking at what happened before and what may be proposed as well, or what may be a change in use based off of the work that takes place. So we're looking at whether a site received permits before or whether the wetland received permits before. And if you have a project that might be within phases, if your first phase has a lot of wetland impacts, your next phase, you might only have a few wetland impacts that are able to be approved. So it's good to show the wetlands program your whole project plan, even if you don't have the full build out. So you can be talking about avoidance and minimization on the whole parcel and for the whole project plan, so that you can really maximize your area for your project purpose. So let's say you have a project that received a general permit because the impacts were lower. If you're coming in for a second permit for the same project a few years later, say you had a parking lot, now you want to expand the parking lot, we're looking at those two changes, and once you meet the general permit threshold, you need to come in for an individual permit because of that cumulative impact. So we are looking at the past permits for that.
Great. And Sam, if that didn't completely answer your question, or you have a specific example in mind, please reach out to Laura or the district ecologist directly, and we could help you navigate that. Cumulative impacts are certainly a much larger topic. He also would like to know if there is a separate permit application for water quality general permits for the failed septics. And you indicated that there is. I believe that link is in the chat, but do you want to comment, Laura?
Yeah, so that's a registration, and it's for impacts within buffer zone. So certainly take a look at the link and contact us if you have any additional questions.
And last two questions, unless anybody wants to drop in the last minute one. From Amy, if the project has two wetlands, do you prefer the single wetland application versus the multiple wetland application?
Ah, great. Yes. Two wetlands, you can fit that on the single wetland application form. There's enough space in the form to write out the information about the two wetlands. Once you get beyond two wetlands, yeah, you'll want to be using the multi-wetland application form with the spreadsheet.
And the last question, which is the $1 million question, and you may not be able to answer or answer fully, is do you mind briefly discussing the changes with the Army Corps regulations regarding Class 3 wetlands?
Certainly. Briefly, and Jay, are you trying to elaborate? I think I heard you. No? Okay. So Army Corps has separate jurisdiction, and that's based off of the waters of the United States. There is a very recent Supreme Court decision called the Sackett case that you can look up online that changes some of the longstanding understanding of which wetlands were protected under their 404 dredge and fill permits. And that includes some very isolated wetlands, but your best bet is to contact the Army Corps of Engineers directly for your specific wetlands to get jurisdictional determinations. I know that there are still many wetlands that are protected in Vermont because we have a very wet state where wetlands are oftentimes connected.
And last two that just quickly came in, Lisa wants to know if there's going to be another link for the feedback and certification request, because she doesn't seem to have the right permissions through this format right now. Is that going to be sent out separately, Laura?
Oh, you know what? I made a mistake, and I think I selected only people from the state of Vermont can respond. So thank you for that. I have put the link again in the chat, and that should be working now. And I'll go and oops, also make that correction for the other one. So we have the feedback form and then a certificate form so that you don't have to give your name while you're giving feedback. You can give us your name separately, so you can be anonymous there. So those links should work. Please let me know, Lisa, if those links don't work.
Great. And then Amy, just as a follow-up, said it would be really helpful if there were instructions for completing the application forms. Are there any plans for that, or am I missing some existing instructions, i.e., we can't find it on the website?
Yeah, Amy, so there are additional guidance for application submittal. There's an admin review page that I can send over to you. I don't have it handy, but for the most part, the instructions we try to embed into the application form. And I've often wondered if we should have a focus group to talk about the application to see if there are some specific areas where we could be providing additional instructions. So Amy, maybe we can follow up on that afterwards.
Great. Well, we're almost a quarter past the hour. Unless there's any last pressing questions, that was it for what came into the chat, Laura.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining, and feel free to contact us if you have any additional questions. And once the snow melts, happy spring. Bye, everybody.